Okay, I am recording. Hello everybody! Welcome back to the dig site. I'm gonna keep it short, because this video is already long as it is. But 200 video subscriber thing. I'm too tired to make a proper sentence right now. And I'm still editing, see? Look, I'll show you. I'm editing, still. It's at 44 minutes. This is gonna be like an hour long. Anyway, though, I'm just gonna get straight to the point. We made it, although we're at like 250 almost now. Whatever, you guys decided to all of a sudden subscribe ever since I posted that Raptor video. So, I'm not complaining though. Thank you. We have succeeded the 200 subscribers. So, this is more like a 250 subscriber special. That's okay. The reason why I haven't posted in 3 weeks is because I've been trying to do this. I had to record myself saying all the stuff, and now I'm on the editing process, which you can see what I'm doing right here. And also, I'm lazy, so yeah. But it's out now. This is probably going to either come out later today, which is the 24th, Christmas Eve, or it's coming out tomorrow, which will be Christmas Day. So maybe a Christmas 250 subscriber special thing. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I'm really tired. Anyway, yeah, that's what I want to say. Sorry I hadn't posted in 3 weeks. I've been focusing on this. If you enjoy this, make sure to like and subscribe, notifications, all that. Watch the video. Yeah, okay, we're done. Enjoy the video. Also, sorry, I almost forgot. I have coffee with me to help, so oh my god. I also forgot to mention Merry Christmas to everybody who's watching this video. Okay, now watch the video. I'm done. Hey, it's the end of your shift. I got it from here, a man told one of the lookouts. The young lookout smiled at the man, yet said nothing as he walked in the direction from where this person had come from. It was the direction of the sleeping quarters. It was around 2 a.m., and everyone but Jimmy was asleep. Jimmy was 6'2", had recently turned 37, and was a very experienced outdoorsman. He was wearing a long-sleeved flannel shirt and blue jeans. He also wore a leather belt as well as a baseball cap he usually had on backward. He had recently agreed to go on a trip with some friends to go hunting on a remote island that was said to hold exotic animals. Exotic animals that were slowly going into extinction. Jimmy didn't see it as poaching. Instead, he saw it as preserving the memory of these creatures. Jim leaned his arms over the front railing of the large sailboat, looking out into the dark abyss. The only thing he could hear was the gentle waves crashing against the sides of the vessel. It was both calming yet also sent shivers down his spine. Not because there was a light, cool breeze, but because the idea of being stranded out here with no light source was horrifying to him. However, he couldn't help but image he was isolated in the middle of the ocean, with no sense of direction, no people, and no land. Just hundreds of miles of the sea. Luckily, an oil lantern was situated by his feet, giving the man some comfort. The oil probably hadn't been changed in a while because very dim light was being produced, but it got the job done. As Jim continued to look into the pitch-black void, barely being able to see 20 feet in front of him, he began to recall why there had to be a lookout. Since they were driving their boat through restricted waters, a lookout had to be placed at the nose of the boat to alert the crew if any authorities caught them. Jimmy looked up in the sky, trying to look for the moon behind the dark gray clouds, thinking it was ridiculous that any authorities would be hundreds of miles off the coast of Costa Rica. But it was better to be safe than sorry. Jimmy closed his eyes, lowering his head to face the open ocean, letting the breeze glide across his face. He remembered the conversation he had back in San Diego with his wife, Mary Ann. When he brought up the upcoming trip, there was some uncertainty among the two. Mary Ann had let Jim go on these hunting trips before, but there was something different about this trip. She had told him one night that she had a bad feeling, and that he should cancel. Jim assured her that it was completely safe, and that it was just her nervous nature that was making her anxious. He told her that he would be back in around a week or so, and that he would take every safety precaution there was. Suddenly, something heavy hit the right side of the boat, shaking the entire vessel. Jim broke out of this little trance, startling him. He waited 1 second to process what just happened, and then leaned down to pick up the oil lantern. He sighed, grabbed the thin handle, and raised it to eye level. He walked over toward where he thought he heard the impact. Great, this is the last thing we need. The boat running into something, Jimmy thought to himself. As he arrived on the side of the boat, he grew hesitant to look over the edge at first, but he eventually extended the lantern over the rail, holding onto the handle tight. Peering over the edge, he could not see anything, other than the reflection of the light bouncing off the water. He brought the lantern closer to the side of the boat, hoping that would make a difference. Luckily for him, it did, and it seemed nothing was damaged. Jimmy sighed in relief, glad that the boat wasn't injured. Must have been a log, Jimmy whispered to himself. He took a few more seconds to examine it a little more, but the only thing he could note was the soft waves crashing against the sides of the sailboat. Jimmy retracted his hand back over the railing, onto his side, still holding it at eye level. He looked back up again into the sky, and without realizing it, the dark gray clouds had moved enough to reveal the giant white glowing surface of the moon. The moon had given enough illumination to where he could now see a decently fair way out into the distance. Not much, but it was certainly better than the eternal darkness that had surrounded him previously. Something suddenly gripped Jimmy's shoulder. His eyes widened while his heart skipped a beat. Jim turned his entire body, quickly spinning around so he could look at whoever was behind him. Whoa, easy Jim, it's just me, the person said, trying to relax Jim. Once Jim was face to face with this person, he let out a sigh of relief, his heart rate returning to normal. It was one of his closest friends, Joshua. Joshua was one of the newest members to join the hunting party. He was 35 years old and enjoyed exploring the world. They became quick friends after Joshua's first hunting trip around a year ago in Africa. During that trip, it was discovered that the two men had much in common. I hope I didn't scare you, Joshua said, giving a light chuckle. Oh, of course not. It's just nerve-wracking when you're the only person out here, Jim said, wiping his brow. Jim walked back over to the front of the boat, where he originally was. Joshua followed close behind him. Why are you out here? Jim asked as he arrived back at the front railing, laying his arms over it once again. Well, Joshua sighed, looking out into the open ocean as he stood beside his friend, his hands placed on the rail. I felt something shake the boat earlier and it woke me up. After that, I couldn't sleep. I checked my watch and realized that it was your shift to be on lookout, so I decided to visit you. Silence overtook the conversation. The two men looked towards the ocean, watching the moonlight reflect off the water. Joshua dressed a lot like Jim. The only difference is that Joshua likes to wear t-shirts instead of long-sleeve shirts. He also sported a nice watch that was gifted by his father. The watch had a brown leather wrist strap, whereas the watch itself was a nice clean silver color. The clouds began to cover the moon once again, turning the glistening water into pure black waves. Jim turned his attention to Joshua, who was still looking at the water, and continued their conversation. I investigated that tremor you were talking about, but I didn't seem to find. Suddenly, something heavy smashed into the left side of the vessel. This time, much harder. It nearly sent Jim over the rail. Luckily, Joshua grabbed onto him just in time. In a panicked state, Jim grabbed the oil lantern, which was now lying on its side, and rushed toward the impact. Joshua was not far behind him. Yet they couldn't even make it to that side before yet another impact shook the boat like crazy, this time on the opposite side. This caused the two men to crash onto the ground, one on top of the other, with the oil lantern slipping from Jim's grasp. Regaining their focus, Jim and Joshua started looking around, realizing that it was now pitch black. The oil lantern was gone. They both stood up, changing their main priority to find the only light source they had. Where is it? Joshua yelled out, not just to Jim, but also to himself. Jim was on his hands and knees, practically blind, trying to see if he could bump into it. I can't find it, Jim exclaimed, as his body began to shiver. The wind had drastically changed to a howling beast, and the ocean turned more intense as larger waves crashed against the sides. This was turning into a nightmare. It must have rolled into the ocean, Joshua yelled to Jim. Jim could barely see Joshua, only knowing where he stood from the sound of his voice. It then began to slowly rain, with a few water droplets splashing against Jim's body. Of course it's raining now. Of course, Jim thought to himself sarcastically. Now the water was becoming more violent than ever. Massive waves crashed up the sides of the boat, with sometimes water splashing onto the deck. Go check with the crew. See what's taking them so long, Jim yelled out to Joshua. He heard a faint okay in the distance, but wasn't sure. The wind was blocking most of his hearing. Jim stood up and began walking towards where he thought was the direction of the sleeping quarters. The rain was picking up pace, and the wind grew colder by the minute. Jim couldn't take much more of this. He was cold and tired, but mostly terrified. He hadn't heard anything from Joshua in a while, which either meant he was checking up on the crew, or something happened to him. He flailed his arms, seeing if they would come into contact with something. His hands then touched something cold and cylindrical. It was the front railing of the boat. He went the wrong way. Before turning round, out in the distance, he heard a loud growl sound, coming from the water. He spun to face where he thought he heard this odd sound until yet another impact occurred, this time hitting the back of the boat, lurching it forward. This caused Jim to slip and fall onto his back, hitting his head on the hard floor. A daze started to brew as he lay motionless on the floor. He was looking up into the night sky as rain pellets battered against his face and body relentlessly. He felt tired, thinking if he just slept, then this would all go away. His blinking started to slow down, as did his breathing. Growing more and more tired as the seconds passed, he began to wonder many things. Where did the lantern go? What's taking the crew so long? Did Joshua hear me? Is Joshua trying to figure out why the crew was taking so long? What's in the water? Why was this happening? Until he finally closed his eyes. The sound of birds chirping and buzzing insects filled Jimmy's ears. His body lay motionless on the warm, coarse sand. As he brought his face off of the ground, he squinted his eyes, trying to adjust to the bright sun. His neck and body ached from any movement, but he managed to push himself into an upright sitting position. Jim closed his eyes and took a moment to catch his breath. After his quick break, he opened his eyes again and began to take in his surroundings. He was facing the open ocean and noticed that sand was sticking to his clothing. The lower half of his jeans were soaked from the little waves that managed to make it to the shoreline. Surprisingly, he wasn't all too injured, apart from a headache and some bruising on his body. After examining himself, he looked to his right. He couldn't see anything other than the curvature of the beach. After a few more seconds, he turned to look to his left. It was extremely hot. The sun was beaming down on the entire island. Jim thought to himself, how did I end up here? Or better yet, where is here? Was it all just a dream? Suddenly, none of that mattered as his eyes lay on a beached sailboat. Jim's eyes widened as he recognized the vessel. He quickly got to his feet, stammering at first, running towards the broken-down boat. As he approached, he could see that the ship was broken in two. The front half was beached on the shore and flipped on its side, revealing the bottom, whereas the second half was just off the coast. There were many pieces of debris scattered amongst the sand. He walked around the broken-off front half of the boat first. He saw that the paint on the exposed bottom and sides was scratched up, with some areas of the underside scraped to where the metallic surface was revealed. Jim then took a better look at the break-off point. He noticed many bits of jagged metal edges, created when it disconnected, but it looked unnatural to him. It seemed as if some big underwater animal had bitten the vessel in two. Jim ignored that suspicion as he moved onto the surroundings of the wreckage, in hopes to scavenge anything useful. He scoured the debris, but could only find an incomplete box of pistol rounds, an empty water bottle that had a hole in the bottom, and one of many hiking backpacks. However, there was nothing inside. As Jim continued to look, determined to find something useful, memory slowly flooded back to him. He remembered that a storm began to brew, and that he had heard some sort of sound coming from the water. He also remembered asking Joshua. Jim gasped. "That's right," he whispered to himself. "Joshua was with me, and I told him to get the crew." Jim stopped searching the sand and bowed his head, closing his eyes. Joshua couldn't have survived that. Damn, it was impressive that he survived. Jim thought about all of his friends who had perished in that horrible accident, knowing that he was the only survivor in that entire group. Still bowing his head, he opened his eyes, and just when he was about to look up, he noticed something. There were unusually large three-toed tracks imprinted in the sand. This grabbed Jim's attention, raising an eyebrow. He kneeled while his eyes slowly followed these tracks from where they originated. They looked like a bird's footprint, but were larger than any bird he knew of. From where he stood, he saw the tracks led into the island's jungle. He looked back at the wreckage, and then back into the jungle. To survive this, he would need food, water, and most importantly, shelter. There was nothing to salvage at the crash site. All of their supplies were lost in the ocean. So making a hard decision, he stood up and began to walk into the forest, not knowing if he would ever come out. The jungle was filled with many large trees and exotic plants. The ground was different with every step, with some parts being soft, marshy floor, turning straight into rough dirt patches. The humidity was unbearable, forcing Jim to roll up his sleeves to somewhat cool himself down, but that barely worked. Weird sounds echoed throughout the entire area, but it is to be expected in places like this. If only I had something to protect myself, Jimmy thought to himself. Jim had been traveling for only 30 minutes, but it felt like hours to him. He eventually collapsed to his knees, needing a break. Practically crawling, he managed to prop himself up on a fallen tree. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. If Jim did not find water soon, he would die of thirst. As his eyes were closed, he heard a grunt not far from where he sat. Jim did not open his eyes, still trying to rest, until he heard the noise again. This time, he opened his eyes. As he directed his attention to whatever this noise was, Jim gasped. 5 feet in front of him stood a relatively small animal. It walked on 2 legs, but its arms were very close to the ground. It had a large, stiff tail that allowed the animal to balance, and it appeared to have some sort of quills emerging out of the top, pointing away from its head. Speaking of which, its head was rather unusual. It had 2 spikes on each side just above the bottom jaw, pointing outward. The head also had a beak that was being used for slicing up plants. The animal seemed to be around 6 feet in length and 3 feet tall. Jim staggered to his feet. He was about to run away. However, after looking at the animal for a few seconds, he realized that it did not care that Jim was standing there. Is it blind? Jim wondered to himself as he began to relax. The animal was just eating away at a fern bush. He looked at the strange creature once more. He saw that the animal was a dark green with specks of yellow dotted around. The underbelly was a nice pale color. He then looked at the feet of the animal and realized that it had 3 toes, just like the footprints he found on the beach. He looked behind where the animal had come from and saw that its tracks seemed to be the same size too. Jim then clicked together what this was. The 3 toes, the long tail, the unusual head. This was a dinosaur. Jim did not know what to think now. He stood there with his mouth slightly open. That's impossible, Jim said out loud. There's no way that any dinosaurs could be alive. What is going on? He spoke aloud enough to get the dinosaur's attention, stopping its activities to look at him. It had a dumb expression on its face, almost like a cow. Jim, too, was looking at the dinosaur, both of their eyes locking on as if it was a no-blinking contest. The small dinosaur then looked away from the man and began to walk away. Curious, Jim decided to follow. The 2 of them walked for around 20 minutes, Jim slacking behind a little since he was so tired. For some reason, Jim began to talk to the animal as if it was going to respond. He knew he was slowly going insane. He fell to his knees dramatically. "I'm gonna die here," he groaned. The animal looked back at him, but for only a second, before returning on its journey. Jim watched as the little animal trotted further away. However, the more he focused on the animal, Jim started to hear a faint sound in the distance, past the tree line that stood in front of him. It sounded very familiar, a continuous flowing sound. It sounded like it was crashing into things constantly. Jim ran straight past the little dinosaur and flew out of the jungle, into an open area. It was beautiful, with many differently size-shaped rocks that looked as if they were placed by people. There was a field that reached to the other tree line, filled with bright green grass. But most importantly, there was a river in the middle of it all. Not rushing fast, but fast enough to make quite a lot of noise. Jim yelled out in excitement, not caring if anything heard him. He practically dived into this paradise, beginning to chug like he had never drank water in his life. As he was on his hands and knees drinking the precious water, he heard not far beside him a grunt. Jim looked to his side and noticed that the dinosaur that led him here was now drinking the water as well. That little dinosaur saved Jimmy's life. He had cheated death once again. He only thought that if he had his rifle, he could forever memorialize it on his wall, as a dinosaur that saved his life on a mysterious island. After Jim was done drinking the water from the river, he stood up and looked across the bank. Jim was scanning the field, seeing if there was anywhere he could potentially camp out for the night, until he noticed something bright and shiny near the tree line. It looked like some sort of small abandoned building, but he was too far to tell. "Maybe there's some food or weapons or something for me in there," Jim said, looking down at the dinosaur as if it was going to respond. He approached the building and immediately saw that this place was abandoned. It was much further than he thought. There was vegetation growing throughout the building's walls and roof, with vines hanging all over the place. The glass was shattered in multiple windows, as well as moss covering most of the sides of the building. However, the building was not small. It was pretty decently large, and it looked like a facility. It was clear to Jim that he was at the back of the facility, so he walked around the building until he found the entrance. Once he got to the front, he was back in the jungle. However, this time, there was a massive dirt pathway that was overgrown with plant life. There was also a big sign at the front of the facility. Jim walked over to the sign so he could get a better understanding of who may have owned the building or what it was used for. Unfortunately, once he got there, the sign was pretty weathered and broken down. There were big bold letters that spelled something out, but half of the letters were gone. The letters spelled I-N, and then the last letter of the sign was another N. That did not help Jim. However, beneath that was a proper sentence that he could read. Some letters were missing, but he knew what the message was. He read out loud to himself, "Genetics and Research Lab." He entered the building, and it smelt rotten, as if something had died and covered the walls with its scent. Some areas of the lab were broken down, due to rainfall or potential dinosaurs rampaging throughout. There were 3 floors, but Jim felt safer staying on the first floor, not trusting the structural integrity of the place. He began his search, scouring through any drawers and cabinets he could find. The place looked ransacked. There were paper documents, wet or dry, all over the floor. Broken lab equipment is scattered throughout as well. Yet while Jim was searching throughout the wreckage of the lab, he couldn't help but wonder what was being done to this place. What were people even doing this far off the mainland? Jim said to himself. Jim then came across a big room, a space full of lab equipment. The room must have been situated at the back of the facility since he could see the open field area once again through the broken windows. However, in the back of the room was a massive mirror. He walked over and realized that it was a one-way mirror. He found it peculiar that this one pane of glass wasn't broken. Jim walked around it, inspecting this anomaly, and saw a door handle leading into this odd room. Walking over to the handle, he twisted it, and luckily it wasn't locked. He went inside and noticed that this one particular room was not damaged at all, not even a scratch. This was in pristine condition. There was one singular desk, a chair, a cabinet resting near the back wall, and one lamp. It almost looked like an interrogation room. Looking through the mirror, he could see out to the river and the field. Jim almost saw this as unnatural, since all he had seen were broken and abandoned pieces of the area. He has not seen a room this clean in a long time. He decided to take a closer look at this small space. He tried to turn on the lamp, but there was no power, of course. He sat down in the chair. His legs needed a break after all the walking he had done. "All right," Jim said. "What is this place hiding?" He pulled one of the drawers from the desk, and on top of a paper pile was a document labeled Creature Creation Authorization, Herbivore. Jim raised an eyebrow and opened the document, placing the material down on the hardwood of the desk. In the document was a booklet of dinosaurs and their pictures. With each page was a different dinosaur, as well as all the information about that particular one. He then came across a section that listed all of the potential herbivores on the island and began to read out all the creatures. Stygimoloch, Pachycephalosaurus, Kentrosaurus, Ankylosaurus, Struthiomimus, Diplodocus, Amargasaurus, Pentaceratops, Borealopelta, Homalocephalae. He could not even pronounce half of these names. Once he flipped through the booklet that showed all the pictures of the herbivorous dinosaurs, he came across a dark green dinosaur with specks of yellow and quills coming out of the tail. He recognized it as the dinosaur that led him to the river. He tried pronouncing its name, Psittacosaurus. He then placed the booklet down and looked for any more documents in any of the other drawers of the desk. After some searching, he managed to find a similar document labeled Creature Creation Authorization, Carnivore. "Interesting," Jim murmured to himself, as if he was uncovering a police case, trying to solve it. He placed the new document in the middle of the desk and moved the old one to the side. He opened the paper, and the contents looked very similar to the other one. It contained a booklet and a list of all the carnivorous dinosaurs on the island. Before looking in the booklet, he looked at the list of names. "Okay, let's see here," Jim whispered to himself. Compsognathus, Eoraptor, Horarosaurus, Guanglong, Ceratosaurus, Mapusaurus, Albertosaurus, Sinosauropteryx. While reading these names out, he noticed that most of the dinosaurs came from a different period, being either from the Triassic, Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. This didn't apply to just the carnivores themselves, but also to the herbivores as well. After Jim read all the names, he then flipped to the back of the page, noticing that there was a separate list. However, there was only one name. Jim raised an eyebrow as he read out the title, Special Class. He then looked below to read the name, Giganotosaurus. Curious, he placed the list of names down and grabbed the booklet. He began to flip through the pages until he found what he was looking for. "Ah, found it," Jim told himself. He found the section for Giganotosaurus and began skimming through the information, wondering why it was labeled as Special Class. Surprisingly, the Giganotosaurus was located at the back of the booklet, and there was barely any information. The only things Jim could find were estimations of its length, height, and weight when it reached adulthood, as well as some facts about its behavior. But the rest of the page was blank, empty. Jim then took a moment to look at the animal's appearance. It seemed to be dark blue, with shades of light blue defining certain characteristics like its crests, and some patterning on the animal's body. It had long muscular arms equipped with sharp claws and stood upright on 2 legs. It had a long, powerful tail to counterbalance its massive body and head. Its head was quite long, measurements beside the picture indicating it had a skull length of 5.2 feet. It made chills run down Jim's spine just thinking about an animal of this size eating a human whole. The pain must be excruciating. He closed the booklet and laid it on the desk, leaning back on his chair, trying to take in all of this information and process it. Jim sighed and then looked out of the mirror and realized that it was beginning to get dark. Wow, I didn't realize that it was getting so late, Jim said in a surprised tone. If anything, though, this seems like a good place to spend the night. Jim spent a bit of time barricading the door in his small new room, just in case the lock gave out. He then looked out of the glass and saw that it was now very dark out, so he got ready to try and get some sleep. Just before he crouched down, though, Jim wanted to see what was in the cabinet. He had been studying the documents all day. He didn't have time to check. He approached the cabinet and grabbed both of the wooden handles attached to the two doors. He tugged once, and they didn't budge. Surprised, he tried again, this time pulling on them harder. Sure enough, the door swung open, almost hitting him in the face. After he recovered, Jim brought his head closer and peeked inside. He took a few seconds, his eyes scanning the inside before he stopped. He locked onto something. He began to grin slowly as he reached into the wooden cabinet and pulled out one pair of working binoculars, an orange-colored flare gun with 2 shells, and a long black rod with a powerful taser attached to the end of it. Jim hit the jackpot. He pulled everything out, closing the cabinet behind him. He placed everything on the desk but kept the electrostaff with him. "My luck is finally turning around," Jim said, excitement leaving his voice. "Now all I have to do is try and contact the mainland and make them save me." He then crouched on the hard floor and leaned against the back wall of the room. "But until then, I need to sleep," Jim finished, closing his eyes as he yawned. He thought about his family and reminisced all of those poaching trips he had with his friends. Eventually, he made one final adjustment, holding the electrostaff in his lap before he dozed off to sleep. A loud screeching sound suddenly alerted the area, causing Jim to jump up in a dazed panic. He grabbed onto the electrostaff tight as he staggered onto his feet, trying to assess the situation. His heart raced as he was trying to look out the window, trying to see what the noise was. But there was nothing. It was still night. Jim slowly began to calm down, realizing he was in no danger. He noticed that there was some illumination coming from the moon and peering onto the open field where the river was. He walked to the desk and sat in the chair, pulling himself closer to the desk. He leaned the electrostaff against the side of the table, picking up the binoculars. He then rested his elbows on the surface of the desk as he brought the binoculars up to his eyes. At first, Jim could not see anything. It was still somewhat dark, even with the help of the illumination coming from the moon. He scanned the field from right to left. He slowly took in every detail he could find as he turned his head. Eventually, his gaze met the flowing river. He stopped to look at it. He grew thirsty as he watched it. Jim then moved his binoculars down the stream of the river until he noticed there was some little green dinosaur. It was the Psittacosaurus. It was sitting on the bank, drinking the water from the river. He watched the little dinosaur for a few moments, admiring it. A couple minutes passed and the Psittacosaurus stopped its activity, turning to walk back into the jungle. Jim followed the animal's movement. He found it funny how it walked, cracking a smile. He then noticed that the dinosaur stopped dead in its tracks. This caught Jim's attention, wondering what it was doing. Silence flew through the air, with only crickets chirping. Time around Jim stood still as he watched the dinosaur, anticipating its next move. He could faintly hear low-pitched grunts coming from the animal's direction, and Jim lowered the binoculars to confirm. After confirming the sound's whereabouts, he looked back in the binoculars. Jim whispered to himself as he continued to stalk the dinosaur. "What are you waiting for? Are you scared? Communicating? What are you doing?" After Jim finished talking, everything stopped. The bugs buzzing, the crickets chirping, it all went silent. This sent chills down Jim's spine as suddenly a large animal busted through the tree line of the jungle, disrupting the silence around him. Jim jumped at the sudden event, his eyes locked on this new creature. The big animal rushed towards the unsuspecting Psittacosaurus and closed the distance in a matter of seconds. This dinosaur was fast. It lowered its big head towards its prey, and in an instant it clamped its powerful jaws around the Psittacosaurus. The little dinosaur emitted a blood-curdling, high-pitched squeal of pain, but it was hopeless. It struggled in the jaws of this predator, but all it was doing was losing more blood. The large predator then threw the Psittacosaurus to the ground, blood spattering all over the green grass, staining it. Jim slowly lowered his binoculars from his eyes, feeling like he was about to throw up. He was shaking. He had seen many animal attacks from a predator attacking prey, but this was much more savage and brutal. He can't believe what he just witnessed, lost for words. Chills started running up and down his body, worried if that could happen to him. The speed, the power, the ferocity, all in one animal. He managed to look through his binoculars once more to see what this predator was doing. Of course, it was eating the lifeless Psittacosaurus's body. ripping out chunks of flesh from the animal's bones, with blood and guts dropping from its mouth. Jim tried to identify it. He knew it was not a Giganotosaurus. It was too small. The coloration of the animal seemed to be light green with a dark green underbelly. Its head looked almost like a T-Rex, wide and bulky. However, there was no list of T-Rex on any of the documents. After some more analyzing, he deducted that the animal he was looking at had to be an Albertosaurus. Jim noticed a few more Albertosaurs come out of the tree line. First one stepped out into the illuminated opening, and then followed by a second, and then another. Soon, there was an entire pack of Albertosaurs near the river. They were drinking the water. Jim lowered his binoculars and sighed. He looked down at the electrostaff, keeping it close just in case something unexpected happened. After a few minutes, he looked back through his binoculars just to make one final note of where the Albertosaurs were situated. However, once he looked through the lenses, the pack of Albertosaurs was not there. Jim gasped, and his heart began racing, directing his eyes all over the open field. He looked for 2 minutes, but felt like forever, until he finally locked onto the pack. They were heading in his direction. However, this time he noticed another dinosaur with them. It looked around 5 feet tall, much smaller than its companions. Jim stopped looking through the lenses. It was a juvenile Albertosaurus. He used his foot trying to bring the electrostaff closer to him, but instead he accidentally kicked it to the floor. The staff crashed against the ground, creating a ringing noise. Jim's eyes widened as he turned to face the staff, his heart beginning to race. That was so loud, Jim thought to himself. It felt like the loudest noise he had ever heard in his life. He turned his attention back to the carnivore, scrambling with the binoculars as he raised them back to eye level as quickly as possible. Once he looked through, he tried tracking down where the pack was, hopefully that they didn't hear the noise. He found them pretty quickly this time, but he froze. "My God," Jim whispered to himself. Through the binoculars, Jim saw the pack of hunters directly staring at him. All their eyes reflected a bright green as they pierced through his soul. He could not move with them staring at him. It's like they knew where he was from a single sound. Jim's hair stood on the back of his neck, and his body grew cold. He dared not to look away, making it like a staring competition, not even wanting to blink, for if he did, it could end his life. His body began to quiver, barely being able to control his hands from shaking. His eyes were doing the best they could to stare at this threat, but he was losing the staring competition. The Albertosaurus pack did not move a muscle. They stared into Jimmy's soul with no remorse, no feelings, its heart colder than the Arctic itself. Just the animal's stare was capable of ripping Jimmy in two. It was dead silent outside, and felt like this was lasting an eternity. But that only intensified the feeling that Jim was going through. If he could put it in one word, it would be hell. Soon this cold-hearted stare was broken off by Jimmy once he noticed that the little Albertosaur was not with the pack anymore. Jim began to panic. He slammed the binoculars on the desk and reached down to the floor to pick up the electrostaff. He then stood up with the weapon and grabbed the flare gun, shoving it in his pant pocket and the 2 shells in the other. He unbarricaded the door and left the room. The last thing I need is to get cornered by these things in a tiny room, Jim thought to himself as he unlocked and opened the door. He started running down the hall, looking for any exit he saw. He hadn't heard any noise from any of the predators. At this point, he expected to hear some ruckus being made outside, or perhaps the juvenile rampaging throughout the facility. All these thoughts ran throughout his head as he came to the end of the hall, turning left. He continued running until he saw an emergency exit. His face lit up, excited to see his savior. He rushed to the door and pushed it wide open. As Jim was about to step out into the dark jungle environment, one of the adult Albertosaurs lowered its head and tried to clamp its jaws around the man in one swift moment. Jim's life flashed before his eyes as he quickly turned around and scurried back inside. He didn't bother to shut the door. He just kept running faster and faster until the emergency door was gone. Jim turned once again in the hall, this time in a room. He took a moment to analyze the room and its escape points. There was a broken window at the back of the room and a lot of empty and destroyed desks. He was about 20 feet from the broken window and he knew he could escape out that way. Suddenly, he heard a noise. Jim noticed that the sound came from the outside of the window. Jim quickly dove under one of the messy desks and began shaking, hiding from his attacker. As Jim sat there, he tried to calm himself down. He took some deep breaths, somewhat helping him, but he was beyond terrified. "I almost just died," he thought to himself, continuing to regain control. "They set a trap. They knew I would come out that way. They set a trap. And where is that baby Albertosaur? I hope it died. That would be one less problem for me to worry about." However, that was not the case. As Jim cowardly sat there, quivering, he heard the noise of footprints land in front of the broken window. Jim closed his eyes. He wondered if one of the adult Albertosaurs was trying to fit in the building. Suddenly, he heard the same footsteps slowly creep around the room, and that's when Jim knew. It was the baby Albertosaurus, and it was in the same room with him. It was only the carnivore large enough to fit in the building. Jim opened his eyes once again and looked down at the electrostaff he was tightly gripping. He shook his head. He wasn't about to play tug-of-war with a dinosaur, especially one that was trying to eat him. The sound of footprints echoed throughout the room, with the odd grunting and sniffing, giving Jim some clarity of knowing the animal's location. The juvenile then emitted a high-pitched roar, causing Jimmy to drop his staff and cover his ears. He gritted his teeth, trying to make the pain go away, but did not want to make any noise. The noise then stopped. The Albertosaurus juvenile was getting angry. Jim looked at the electrostaff and not realizing he dropped it. Damn, I dropped it? Hopefully this thing didn't hear me, Jim thought to himself angrily. This was a life-or-death situation, and if he was going to be clumsy, then he would certainly meet death sooner than he wanted. He swore under his breath as he slowly reached out for the staff. Jim didn't realize that while running away, the clouds had covered the moon, making it significantly darker than it was 5 minutes ago. He felt around with his hands. The ground felt soft and mushy in some spots, yet then hard again in others. Jim had a rough idea of where the staff was. It couldn't have rolled too far away, but saying that, it was incredibly dark. Come on, where is this stupid thing? Jim thought to himself. If only I had a flashlight or some of the moon's light, or anything to help me see in the dark. Jim then touched something cold and cylindrical. It was the electrostaff. Jim let out a faint sigh, relieved that he found his only protection. However, it seemed that he was given a return sigh, coming from just behind the desk he was hiding under. Jim slowly looked around himself, not retracting his arm from under the desk. Jim was frozen, not quite sure if he heard something or if it was just his nerves playing mind tricks on him. He waited for a second, sitting in silence, not daring to move a muscle. Jim wanted to make sure that this potential sound was indeed just him making things up. However, this was the longest second of his life. It felt like an eternity. Sweat began dripping down his forehead and into his eyes. His palms began to sweat profusely. Jim wanted to scream at the top of his lungs, but he knew if he did, then the juvenile Albertosaurus, another sigh, appeared, this time directly in front of him, around 5 feet away. Jimmy clenched every muscle in him, his body incredibly tense. The Albertosaurus juvenile had found him, and Jim knew it. Jim slowly began to retract his arm back under the desk, pulling along the staff as he thought, why doesn't it attack? Is it mimicking my sigh? Does it know I'm here, or is it just toying with me? Perhaps it's playing a little game of hide-and-seek before it eats me. All of these thoughts were flooding Jim's head as he fully brought his arm back to his body. Jimmy has never made such quiet and precise movements in his entire life. He was so quiet, he could rival those mimes people see on television. He did not want to make any sudden movements. Maybe if I aim the tip of the electrostaff towards this thing, then it will electrocute the baby Albertosaurus when it strikes, Jim thought to himself, thinking of strategies and ways of escaping this nightmare, as if he were playing one big game of chess. A game of chess that depended on his life. Jim then slowly shifted his body around so that the tip of the staff faced outward, away from him. Suddenly, he heard it again, that sigh, this time much closer, perhaps around 3 feet from him. However, Jim knew it was not a sigh, but rather it was a juvenile Albertosaurus's breath, the animal ready to attack. He smelled the Albertosaurus' rotten smell. Undoubtedly, the smell was coming from its mouth. Jim then slowly moved his fingers up and down the pole until his finger bumped into something that felt like a switch. My God, I hope that this turns on, Jim thought to himself, anticipating when the animal would make its move. Jim started to contemplate whether or not he should turn it on or not. It could scare the animal, or it could draw it in closer. Is this thing even scared of electricity? What happens if it doesn't work? I'll be cornered in by this desk. All these questions, but not many answers. The animal began to emit a very low rumbling sound, but to Jim it sounded very loud. The sound then started to inch closer and closer by every second that passed. The sound released slight vibrations that were powerful enough for Jim to feel. It also grew louder, with Jim wanting to cover his ears, but he had to hold his ground. It was now or never. The animal was getting ready to pounce. Jim could feel it in his body. He could imagine this big animal pouncing onto him and pushing him through the desk, slowly ripping into Jim's soft flesh, eating him alive. Then the animal attacked, letting out a blood-curdling roar as it charged into Jim, with Jim flicking the switch. The electrostaff buzzed to life as a blue crackle of energy ignited at the tip. It was the most horrifying picture Jim could have ever imagined. When the blue spark of light illuminated the pitch-black underside of the desk, Jim yelled out in terror. The dinosaur's face was mere seconds away from slicing off his head. Its front body was nearly crouched under the same desk as him. If Jim had not turned on that electrostaff any sooner, then he would surely have been killed. It was perfect timing. The little dinosaur got electrocuted for 5 seconds straight before the power ran out. "Damn it, already?" Jim exclaimed, angry that the battery had already run out. The animal fell to the floor, with the sound of silence following right after. Did it work? Jim thought to himself, waiting many seconds before making any moves. The baby Albertosaurus seemed to be motionless, but was still alive. He could still hear the loud breathing coming from the creature. Jim climbed out from under the desk, looking at the juvenile helplessly lay there. He then threw the electrostaff onto the animal's body. He wasn't going to carry something that didn't work. Jim then let out a huge sigh of relief, but knew that it wasn't over. He looked towards the broken window. Finally, his escape. Jim ran to the window and jumped out, not caring if any larger theropods were around him. All he knew was that he was not spending another minute in that genetics lab with that Albertosaurus. Once his feet landed on the soft, squishy earth, Jim started to sprint, his adrenaline at an all-time high. He did not know where the other adult Albertosaurs were, and didn't know if they were chasing him or not. Jim also did not know which direction he was going in, but it was deeper into the jungle, that was for sure. He couldn't see nor hear the river or the field, so he must be running in the opposite direction. Jim ran for a long time before his adrenaline slowed down, until he completely stopped. Jim started to gasp for air. As he began coughing, he was exhausted from running. As he coughed, he turned to look back, not seeing much except for the dark outlines of trees and vegetation. Once Jim calmed down and stopped coughing, he took a second to process what just happened. I just survived that. I just survived being eaten by a killer dinosaur, Jim yelled out in excitement as he began to laugh. Oh my god, I'm still alive. I can't believe it! Jim then fell to his knees, his pants legs getting wet and covered in mud. It was a miracle that Jim survived. Not only the encounter, but running blindly into the jungle without tripping on anything. Jim had survived every encounter of death, but he wasn't out of this yet. Jim took a few seconds before standing up again, still panting from his run. He then looked up. Luckily, there were small patches from the treetops where Jim could look through, towards the sky. It was still very much nighttime, the moon still covered up by the clouds. Jim wished he knew how much longer it was until sunrise. I have to be the luckiest person alive, Jim said out loud to himself. Jim then looked down at the ground, staring at the mud. He let his body breathe in the surroundings. The bugs were alive, buzzing from plant to plant. The odd bird calls lit up the jungle's deep, dark, ominous presence. The mud was soft, squishing, and cool, making Jim want to roll around in it, but restrained himself, not wanting to get his clothes too dirty. The air was still humid, but dramatically different from the morning. Jim felt alive. Just as Jim was about to stand up, out of the mud, he noticed something trapped inside of it. It was not far, only a few feet in front of where he was sitting. It was a small, dark object. Well, everything was a dark object around him, but it had an unnatural design. Jim squinted his eyes, and then started to crawl on his hands and knees, moving closer to his discovery. As he moved closer to the small, weird-looking shape, the clouds began to clear up once again. Jim was now within arm's reach away from the small object. He reached into the mud and pulled it out. Jim stood up while trying his best to clear the mud off the object. The clouds by now have completely dispersed, and the moon shone brightly on the island once again. It was still a little challenging for Jim to identify what he was holding. However, those patches from the treetops made it somewhat easier to see, allowing moonlight to peer through, illuminating bits of the jungle floor. Jim relied partially on his eyesight, but mostly on touch to feel what it was. He noticed that there was some sort of leather strap, and it seemed to flop all over the place if he shook it very fast. He also noticed that there was some hard circular material around the middle of the leather strap. Jim moved into one of the treetops' open patches, into the moonlight, and the hard material began to glimmer and shine. That's when Jim realized it was a watch. But not just any watch, it was Joshua's watch. There was no denying it. The leather strap, the shine from the silver color when exposed to the moonlight, it was Joshua's watch. Jimmy's eyes widened, his mouth slightly dropping open. It's impossible, Jim whispered to himself. He was speechless, barely capable of putting a sentence together. How, what, this can't, I don't... Jim continued to gaze at the watch for many minutes. Still in shock, many questions ran through his head. He stood there in the humid air as a slight breeze began to run through the jungle's dense foliage. Suddenly, something broke Jim out of his trance. Movement only a couple of feet away from him. It sounded heavy. Each footstep crashed against the ground as it walked through the jungle night. Jim quickly slipped the watch into his pant pocket that held the two shells and pulled the orange flare gun out of the other. He looked up and straight ahead of himself, identifying that that was where the sound was coming from. The footsteps grew louder as they began to approach Jim, with sticks and overhead branches snapping. Whatever was approaching him, it was big. Suddenly, the heavy footsteps stopped. However, so did the surrounding wildlife. The bugs stopped buzzing, birds stopped chirping, and the jungle became completely silent. This sudden change startled Jim, more than the massive animal that was approaching him. The silence sent shivers down his spine. Is the animal hesitating? Jim thought to himself. He looked at the flare gun in his hand. I'm not wasting this chance, Jim thought again as he raised his opposite hand, resting it over the top of the barrel of the flare gun. He cracked the barrel open, examining the inside the best he could, realizing that there was no shell loaded. I knew it, Jim whispered to himself as he reached down into his pocket, pulling out one of the shells. He was not going to get into another tug-of-war game with the dinosaur without checking or preparing his weapons. He inserted the shell and snapped the orange barrel shut. The flare gun was loaded. All Jim had to do now was pull the hammer back and fire. Jim hoped that the sudden bright red light would distract and confuse any attacking predators. The moon yet again was being covered by the dark gray clouds, shrouding the jungle in total darkness. Jim could see nothing, except the pitch-black outlines of surrounding trees and vegetation. That light breeze suddenly began to grow into a howling windstorm. The trees shook relentlessly, and the sound of wind filled Jimmy's ears. However, there was still no noise from any surrounding animals, not that he could tell at least. Even though he was in the jungle, the wind was somehow still powerful enough to force him back. Jim had to reposition his stance to not fall, gripping the flare gun close and tight to his body. The surrounding trees were barely capable of resisting the power of this wind, creaking and snapping with every minute that passed. The leaves on nearby bushes slowly started to rip off one by one as well. Then, not long after, Jim felt a droplet of rain hit his head, and then another, until a raindrop started to bombard the island. A storm was beginning to form. After a couple of minutes, the wind started to calm down. However, it seemed that the rain was nowhere near coming to a stop. Jim had not moved from his position, even after getting nearly knocked off his feet during the windstorm. The jungle was still in total darkness, but at least he could finally hear again. Jim could hear the sound of raindrops smacking against the mushy floor and the overhead leaves of the surrounding trees. Yet still, he noticed that no animal noises were coming from any direction. Jim looked around, slowly, until he turned his attention toward where he last heard the dinosaur. Maybe he got spooked and ran off from the rain, Jim wondered to himself. However, he was not entirely sure, so he decided to wait an extra few minutes before making any moves. While standing in the dark jungle, Jim felt a sudden cold chill run up his spine. It could have been because his clothes were damp, or maybe the rain crawled down his face and neck. It could have been because he was standing alone in the middle of nowhere with no light source and barely any protection. Suddenly, a dreadful feeling arose inside Jimmy's stomach. I'm just overthinking things. I'm just scaring myself, Jim thought to himself, trying to relax about the situation he was in. He stared out into the dark abyss, beginning to wonder things like what time it was, or what was the animal that was making all those sounds. It seemed that the longer Jim stared out into the darkness, the more the darkness would close around him. Jim began to shiver. He held out the flare gun still the best he could, but was jittering around too much. The rain continued to overtake the island, picking up speed. Jim got a sinking feeling that something was wrong. He tried to turn around, but his body would not let him, almost trying to warn him of something. Jim could not see anything if he tried squinting. He was completely blind, only being able to rely on his touch and hearing, even though he heard nothing except the rain splattering against himself and the area. Suddenly, a large gust of wind hit the back of his neck. However, it wasn't cold like the wind before. No, this time it was oddly warm, and it also seemed to have an odor to it as well. Jim froze, not daring to move now. The jungle was silent before, but now it felt even more quiet, even with the rain. He then heard a low rumbling sound, vibrating his entire body. Jim couldn't decide to stay still or turn around and face his worst nightmare. Jim stood perfectly still until eventually he gathered the courage to turn around. As he started to slowly twist his body, another hot breath of air was pushed into his face. The smell was rotten and made Jimmy almost throw up. As he turned, Jimmy slowly raised the flare gun above his head, not too fast to make any sudden movements. His arms was still shaking intensely. His movements were almost as slow as a snail's, not wanting to provoke whatever was behind him. Once Jim's head was fully turned, he could see only darkness. Did it leave? Jim pulled the hammer back, making a clicking noise. The noise was quiet, yet loud enough to disrupt the silence around him. The rain continued to plummet against the trees. Jim was cold, shaking with fear, and felt like he was going to throw up all of his organs. He put his index finger on the trigger and squinted his eyes shut. Slowly, he began to squeeze the trigger. Another moment passed, with just the sound of rain smacking the earth. What was this creature waiting for? Was it messing with him? Or perhaps it did leave. Just as Jim was going to pull the trigger, he opened his eyes wide. He had to know what was behind him. If he was going to die, he had to know from what. Without warning, a puff of smoke shot out of the barrel as a burning flare flew up into the sky. The flare illuminated the surrounding vegetation for a few seconds, tinting the jungle floor bright red. Jim's eyes were wide as he scanned everything in front of him, but there was nothing. Was it all in his head? Was Jim just imagining these events? Jim lowered the flare gun back to his side, as the red glow quickly vanished from the jungle, returning it into total darkness. He sighed in relief. I must have been imagining it, Jim thought to himself. Suddenly, Jim heard those same footsteps yet again, directly in front of where he was looking. They were coming closer. Jimmy's heart raced, yet instead of standing his ground, he clutched onto the flare gun and ran. Adrenaline coursed through his body as Jim started to sprint away from these monstrous footsteps. Thorns, wet leaves, low-hanging branches cut into Jim's body as he ran for his life. He didn't know why, but for some reason, this creature, out of all the other ones he encountered, was the most terrifying. He hadn't even seen the beast yet, but deep down inside, Jim imagined that it was the most horrifying thing that he had seen. The darkness surrounded him, no matter what direction he decided to go, almost as if it was stalking his every movement. The sound of the footsteps slowly vanished, with the rain being the only sound that filled his ears. How? How can it move around without me hearing it? Its footsteps were so heavy. How is it possible to sneak around me with such loud footsteps? Jim wondered. Wait, could it have used the windstorm to mask its loud footsteps in order to get behind me? He thought as he continued to run. He was in full panic mode, tripping over things like roots that stuck out of the ground, or stumbling down unexpected slanted slopes. If that was the case, if this dinosaur used the wind to cloak its sound, then that meant this was an extremely intelligent dinosaur. Jim must have run for several minutes, maybe even an hour before he got tired. He smashed through a patch of tall grass, and immediately the rain felt heavier on his body, forcing him to slow down. Jim took a few more steps before he collapsed to his hands and knees, his head almost touching the ground as he gasped for air. Jim's heartbeat returned to a normal pace after taking a few deep breaths, slowly regaining his focus. He looked up, and without realizing it, he had run into a clearing. Not the same one near the genetics lab, but one very similar. The rainfall was much more devastating out in the open, since the trees protected him overhead in the jungle. It felt as if many tiny pebbles were being chucked at his body all at once, repeatedly. Jim stood up, trying to examine this new area he had discovered the best he could. Since it was so dark, he couldn't see much, but he knew that the tall grass surrounded the border of the tree line. Looking on the ground, it also seemed that dirt patches were spread all across the field, but had turned to mud due to the weather. Jim's back was facing the tree line, but in front of him was what seemed to be the ocean. He heard waves crashing against rocks. He had made it to the coast. Heavily breathing, Jim walked a few steps forward. Now that he had calmed down a bit, he realized that he had to watch his foot placement, not knowing what could be out on this new terrain. How can it seem even darker out in the open than in the jungle itself? Jim wondered to himself as he continued forward. The wet ground would change constantly, from comforting wet grass to squishy mud. This was the only way for Jim to identify where he was. The darkness that surrounded him was the equivalent of squeezing your eyes shut, but his only main priority right now was to reach the beach. Every step he took felt closer to the crashing waves. There was finally something to listen to other than the splattering rainfall. As Jim continued on, he wondered about the creature that stalked him in the dark jungle. Maybe I lost it. I didn't hear anything following me. Plus, I was running pretty fast. I must have lost it. Jim then thought of nothing as he continued on, as he heard the ocean more clearly now. Jim stopped in his tracks and looked up. The rain is slowing down, Jim thought to himself, as he looked up at the gray clouds that covered the night sky. My wife, he whispered to himself. Jim had completely forgotten about society, his family, friends, everything, ever since he first landed on this island. He never got the chance to think about anything else since his main priority was survival. Will I ever see my family again? What if I can't escape this island? Jim continued to whisper to himself. The rain started to gradually let up, the impacts lessening with every second that passed. As he looked up at the sky, rain droplets slapped against his face, rolling down to his chin. The cold did not seem to affect the man anymore. His body was numb from his soaking wet shirt and jeans. Was this all just a dream? Jim said, looking down at the muddy floor. Is this all fake? Am I just dreaming this? Living, breathing dinosaurs running freely across a mysterious island. It seems like a dream to me. Jim stared at the ground as the rain finally stopped. He looked ahead of himself. The sound of the ocean was much clearer now. Jim looked at the flare gun in his hand and watched it. I forgot I had this, Jim thought. I'm surprised I didn't drop it while running. Jim gently released his grip on the flare gun until it dropped out of his hand, falling on the floor. Jim was incredibly tired. He had not slept for many hours, his eyes drooping, his body relaxed. He wanted to fall on his face and take a nap, but resisted the urge, and kept moving forward. Jim took a step forward and heard a snapping sound beneath his foot. Jim froze, his entire body suddenly tensed. His mind woke up, becoming more alert. He had not heard a sound like that before. It sounded like he stepped on a twig and broke it in half, but that wasn't it. Jim took a step back and scanned the area, thinking it may have been something else that had made that noise. But like always, he could not really see much or hear much. He looked at the floor once again and then crouched down. He felt around the area where he took that step, until his fingertips eventually felt an odd slimy substance spread across the floor. It was difficult to know what it was, since the more he felt this substance, the more he mixed it with the mud. Jim raised an eyebrow as he sat there, trying to figure out what this was. However, it was not just a slimy and sticky substance, but there was also small pieces of something. They were thin yet hard. It seemed to have a rough, bumpy texture on the outside and a smooth texture on the inside. Jimmy's facial expression quickly turned from curiosity to terror. "My God," Jim said quietly as he slowly stood up. Although he could not see what he had stepped on, he could recognize what it was just by feeling it. The slimy and sticky substance with the small thin pieces mixed in with it. Jim had stepped on an egg. And where there were eggs, that also meant that there was a nest nearby. And usually where there is a nest, that also means... A loud growl appeared from behind him. His body vibrated intensely. Jim recognized this growl. His heart began racing, like it did back in the forest. His heartbeat thumped in his chest so fast he could hear it. His face was becoming wet once again, but it wasn't from the rain. Instead, it was the sweat dripping down his face. Jim slowly turned his body around to look at this beast. What do I do? What do I do? Can I run? No. It would easily catch me. Do I crouch down? No, it could probably smell me. What do I do? Jim tried to think of multiple strategies to escape the situation, but no matter how hard he thought, Jim second-guessed himself. Do I even have time to react? I didn't feel its breath this time, and I haven't smelt anything yet. Maybe it's farther away. Throughout all of his life in the poaching business, Jim had been in quite a few sticky situations, but he always knew what to do, like knowing about their weaknesses and how to avoid getting scratched or bit. But never has Jim encountered an animal like a dinosaur. He did not know how to avoid them or how to survive an attack. Jim was completely out of his league. The dark gray clouds moved away from the moon, allowing Jim to see once again. The light illuminated the entire field. As he fully turned around, his body tensed, ready for something to rip into him, his eyes squinting in preparation for the pain he was about to endure. However, as he now faced the opposite direction, there was nothing massive standing behind him. Instead, Jim's eyes locked onto a massive bipedal dinosaur that stood in between the tall grass barrier and the tree line. Its massive head with its reflective eyes staring into Jimmy's soul. Luckily for Jim, he had walked quite a ways away from the tree line, putting some distance between him and the intruder. Jim watched the creature as it stalked him. It was motionless. He concluded that the animal was around 20 or 25 feet tall, its massive head nearly the length of himself. Jim could not accurately determine how long it was since the animal's back half was being blocked by the large trees, but he had a horrible feeling that he would soon find out. All he knew was that this dinosaur was much larger and much more dangerous than the Albertosaurs. As Jim watched this animal stare into him, a sudden spike of coldness shot up his spine. His body started to shake uncontrollably, even worse than before. Jim wanted to look away, but he did not want to leave himself vulnerable. As long as he kept his eyes on the dinosaur and monitored its every move, he would be fine. Jim crossed his arms and planted his feet firmly against the soft floor, trying to control his shaking, but he could not. His stomach twisted and turned to the point where he was about to vomit. His face was now drenched with sweat as he stared into the animal's piercing eyes. Jim stood there only for 3 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. He barely blinked, for if he even rested his eyes, he may lose the upper hand. The large animal then took a step forward, Jim taking note of its movement. Once the large leg planted against the floor, it shook the ground. There was no denying it. This was the dinosaur that had stalked him back in the forest. It took another step, but paused, and then took another. Each step almost knocking Jim unbalanced, but he stood his ground. What is it doing? Jim wondered, confused at the animal's movements. Is it trying to hunt me? Does it think I haven't spotted it yet? The large animal paused again, until it took one more step, planting its feet firm against the ground. Jim couldn't tell what this behavior was. The only thing he could relate this to was the actions of a cat. Cats, either domesticated or wild, sneak and stalk relatively the same, taking their time and moving slow enough as to not make any noise. but to see this behavior in an animal as big as a dinosaur was odd. Its footsteps were too loud to sneak around, so what was it doing? The massive dinosaur was now fully out of the jungle and onto the illuminated field, and Jim could easily see the entire length of the animal. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The animal easily reached around 40 feet in length, from head to tail. It seemed that the animal was dark blue with some patterning along its body. It also had some shades of lighter blue to define certain features. That's when Jim realized that the dinosaur before him was the Giganotosaurus, and Jim had entered its territory, where its eggs were nested. Jim continued to shake, somewhat controlling it, but his nerves overpowered his actions. The animal's stare was 10 times worse than the Albertosaur's. It was almost like the Giganotosaurus was intentionally grabbing Jim's attention, almost like it was physically forcing him to look into its ferocious eyes. Jim wanted to give up. He was so exhausted, but he needed to persevere, for his family. Jim let out a shaky sigh, his body still tense. "What are you gonna do?" he whispered to himself. "What are you going to—" Suddenly, Jim got pushed to the ground and onto his stomach. Something large and heavy shoved him to the ground from behind. Jim scrambled from his stomach, spinning his body around to lay on his back, his elbows submerged in the mud as he rested on them. Looking up at his attacker, he noticed what pushed him. Jim watched in horror as he realized what pushed him. It was another Giganotosaurus. Its rotting breath filled Jimmy's nostrils as its massive head beamed down at him. Jim's eyes widened as he was mere feet away from the large beast. Jim was lost for words. He could not even let out a scream. He was stunned, shocked, terrified. Many emotions ran through his body, but he was slightly amazed. These large Giganotosaurs managed to set a trap. The one near the tree line was a decoy, so that I would direct all of my attention towards that one, whereas the real problem was slowly advancing towards me from behind, its footsteps incredibly quiet, until it finally reached and immobilized me, Jim thought to himself, slowly beginning to understand how these dinosaurs behaved. Even in the jungle, although it has the ability to be quiet, the decoy was set to make loud noises when walking, while the other snuck up on me from behind. But I managed to get away from them because of the flare, which spooked them. On the outside, Jim was terrified, but on the inside, he was amazed by the animal's strategies and intellect. He looked at the dinosaur as its mouth slowly opened. Jim's eyes widened even more, his mouth dropping. The large Giganotosaurus was about to strike, its mouth growing wider and wider. But to Jim, time moved slower, almost as if it was stopping. His thoughts were trying to process everything, but he was thinking about many things. His family, his friends, his wife, everything was overloading his mind. He stared up into the jaws of the dinosaur until time started to speed up. Jim let out a blood-curdling scream as his mind realized what was happening. The jaws of the Giganotosaurus plummeted to the ground, clamping around Jim's upper body. Jim let out a scream of pain, his head and torso now in the mouth of the dinosaur. Blood drained out of his body as the Giganotosaurus raised its head, pulling Jimmy along with it. Jim was in intense pain. The sharp serrated teeth had pierced right through the man. His legs flailed as he tried to save himself, but the Giganotosaurus responded by clamping down on the man again. Jim yelled in pain once again, his muffled screams coming from inside the dinosaur's mouth. The Giganotosaurus shook Jim's body for a few seconds before his legs ripped off his torso. Blood now poured out of Jim as his consciousness started to fade in and out. He continued yelling, but he knew he could do nothing. Jim slowly started to calm down, his eyelids feeling heavier. The powerful dinosaur was going to eat Jim alive, and Jim knew it. It isn't their fault, Jim thought as his body started to relax more as the pain started to numb away. I was an intruder who broke into their nest and smashed an egg. They were just protecting their territory. Jim closed his eyes, the pain almost completely numb. His final moments, his final thoughts before passing out was, "Where are you? Where are you, Joshua?"